Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Srce pita, rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srce pita. героева и усияю жито. Распихивай под съездом слободы, под руком партии и под сердцем Тита. Распихивай под съездом слободы, под руком партии и под сердцем. 'Tis
Super Greetings to everybody and welcome along. It is the evening of the 24th of May 2024 and you join me tonight for a live stream which is going to do exactly what it says on the tin, to quote an old advert on British television. And this of course refers to the title of tonight's episode, which is of course Boris the Banderite. And if you're familiar at all with the name Boris and what it means, Boris is the stage name for a certain Alexander Boris the Johnson. And Boris is his stage name because his actual name is, rather embarrassingly, the same as mine. But Boris, of course, has been the performing monkey for the lobby that is heavily in favour of continuing the war on Ukraine, and it should be emphasised that it is very much a war on Ukraine, and the Ukrainian working class especially, waged principally by imperialism, and more to the point, British and US imperialism, with the Germans and the French tagging along. So, we are going to look at tonight some comments made by the rather disgusting personage of Mr. Johnson at a recent gathering of the foul and the revolting creatures that consist of the, or should we say make up the personnel of the Conservative Parliamentary Party. And we're going to be looking at some other comments that are similar from some similarly revolting American senators, or I should say congressmen. And we're going to get straight into this, and what we're going to do is go through this and then go through the various video clips, talk about those, and then I'm going to pause for questions and comments from the chat after about half an hour to 40 minutes or so. So let's get straight into it with this particular clip, and this comes to us courtesy of Active Measures, the podcast presented by friend of the show Kit Clarenberg and Alexander Rubinstein. And it is Alexander Rubinstein apparently who dug out this particular clip that comes from a well, I think the best way to call it is a rally that a bunch of British MPs held for some members of the Azov regiment recently. Nothing new there, of course, but this is particularly brazen. So I present to you the inestimable and altogether despicable Mr. Johnson, recorded earlier this week, and we'll talk about it just after the clip.
Thank you to the heroes from the Azov Brigade who warned us about their presence tonight. Give the Ukrainians what they need. Give them the weapons. Give them the authorization to use those weapons outside their own borders if necessary. Now, absolutely ludicrous that Ukrainians should be forbidden from doing what Putin is doing himself and attacking Ukrainian forces. Why on earth shouldn't Ukrainians be able to attack Russian forces mustering on?
Just so you know, just to give you an indication of who's who here, if you look slightly beyond Boris, so to his left, is a bald-headed gentleman by the name of Ben Wallace. He's the former Defence Secretary who has got out of the job and run away and is stepping down as an MP. So that's who that other guy is there.
Their borders. Give them those weapons, give them the attackers, give them the budget, give them the air defences that they need. It's the single best investment that we can make in the defence of the whole Euro-Atlantic area, is supporting Ukrainian heroes. We rely wholly on heroes such as the people who are here tonight with us from the Azov Brigade. My message...
Right, so very clear message there from a certain Mr. DeFeffel Johnson. He calls the Azov Brigade heroes, so the question should of course, or could of course, be posed to him. If he considers fascists heroes, what does that make him? But of course, Boris isn't running for election again. He rather wisely stepped down as an MP a number of months ago and isn't running again this time. He's run away. So he has, of course, made himself unavailable for questioning. Perhaps we should put in a request for an interview to him, though it should be said here that he is not alone in making these demands. So what were his demands in that clip we just played? So the demands that Boris Johnson was making are that the Ukrainian armed forces should be allowed to fire the long-distance weaponry, such as the ATACMS missile, the Storm Shadow missiles that the British Ministry of Defence has given them, and the Scalp missile that the French have given them. And they should be allowed to fire those at targets inside the pre-1991, or sorry, post-1991 borders of the Russian Federation. Now, this is one of those farcical constructs that has come up over and over again in this particular war, which is the idea that there are limitations on what the Ukrainian forces, acting of course as a proxy force for US imperialism, have always things they've always done, but it's just that NATO, or really the US, has liked to preserve some plausible deniability. So they've always used Western-supplied weapons to attack Crimea, for instance. They've always done that. The Ukrainians have used Western-supplied weapons to launch raids into the Belgorod region, raids run by these Russian fascist formations. And those people are often equipped with Western weapons. They've used Western weapons to launch raids on, or should we say artillery strikes on Belgorod. So this distinction that Boris Johnson is claiming exists quite obviously doesn't exist. They've just not openly admitted that they're doing it. So what Boris Johnson is effectively calling for is to drop the facade. That's really all he's calling for, or to allow this to go further than it has already. And we'll come into why he's saying these things a little bit later. But here we must bring in some representatives from across the pond, as we put it here in England, from the former colonial possession of perfidious Albion, that is, of course, the United States. And the US Congress has been essentially making the same point as Boris Johnson in many contributions from the esteemed members of the House of Representatives across the course of this week. Here we go with a certain Mr. Keane, a Republican representative, and he's saying practically the same thing as Boris Johnson. Here we go.
That Ukraine has a sovereign right to conduct this war as they see fit. However, they will not be able to do so if they are worried that this administration will publicly rebuke them afterwards, as you did when Ukraine struck Russian oil refineries earlier this year. They must know.
He's speaking, by the way, to Tony Blinken in Blinken's testimony before the House Foreign Affairs Committee earlier this week.
That America truly supports their need to fight this war as they see fit. Will this administration explicitly allow Ukraine to strike targets in Russian territory and Russian airspace?
Congressman, as you may know, I was just there about 10 days ago, spent a lot of time with President Zelensky, other leaders, and I'm determined to make sure that...
He was performing bad cover versions of Neil Young, by the way. That's what he was doing over there, in a restaurant that was explicitly decorated in Nazi memorabilia. They took down some of the obvious stuff from the walls just before he came in, but it was a Nazi-owned club. So Tony Blinken, who's always going on about Israel needing to be there to be a safe place for Jews, well, perhaps the reason why is because, of course, he's so determined to carry on backing fascist forces who actually butchered the Ukrainian Jewish population. Tony Blinken hypocritically cited his own family's origins in historic Ukraine, or Ukraine when it was part of the old Tsarist Empire, and his family's terrible experiences with anti-Semitism, which of course goes all the way back to, well, the traditions of both Tsarist Russia and, of course, Austria-Hungary, which was the other power who had influence over what is now Ukraine over 100 years ago now. But of course, he's more than happy to sponsor the political descendants of the people who persecuted his own family. So whenever you see a rich guy like Tony Blinken babbling away about the safety of the Jews, well, he doesn't mean that, really. I mean, what he means is he's prepared to use the historic memory of the persecution of his own family to make a sordid political point. But when it comes to the safety of the Jews, Tony Blinken really thinks about the safety principally of his own class, whether Jewish or otherwise.
They have what they need to effectively defend themselves, and we're in an ongoing conversation about them in terms of what that requires at any given time. We have to date not endorsed or enabled strikes outside of Ukrainian territory. We're always...
That's a lie. They have specifically enabled strikes outside of post-1991 Ukrainian borders. I mean, those raids across the border of the Russian Federation done by the Russian fascist organizations, the shelling of Belgorod, the drone strikes on Russian Air Force bases like the Engels Air Force Base, all of this is done with the full knowledge of the United States. So they just pretend that they haven't launched it. They just pretend that they weren't aware of it. Oh, well, Ukraine, very bad for doing that. But all that they're really saying is they're going to drop the pretense.
Always open to conversations with them to see what they need and the decisions that they make, what we can do to support them throughout this 2 years, more than 2 years now. We've worked to get them what they need, when they need it, to be as effective as possible in repelling the Russians.
Respectfully, this administration has with frequency delayed the weapons that President Zelensky has needed in a timely fashion to actually accomplish the mission of defeating Putin's invasion, illegal invasion of Ukraine. I urge you to reverse this dangerous policy. Russia has fought this war with gloves off since day one, and we cannot continue to tie Ukraine's hands.
Right, well, that's enough of Mr. Keane. Apparently he's from New Jersey. Apologies to any New Jersey residents watching us this evening. But then again, our own political representatives in merry old England, of course, are no better. Notice he's reading that, by the way. At least Boris Johnson can improvise. You'll notice that when a lot of these guys say anything, they're always reading it off a piece of paper in front of them. Because it's not their thoughts. These are talking points which are given to them, sometimes by the State Department, sometimes by a think tank, sometimes by their policy advisors who come from a think tank, which provides staff for the State Department. Now, I doubt Mr. Keane has had an original thought in his life. Now, speaking of unoriginal assholes, here's another one. Notice same points being hit.
Going on, as you know, this is a sanctuary zone.
This is, by the way, Michael McCall. I believe he's a Republican, wouldn't make much difference though, and got a visual aid with him, which is of course always entertaining, and he's the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee
That the Russians have created, and what they're doing is they're lining up all their artillery and rockets and missiles just across the Ukraine border that they then use to attack the Ukrainians. However, your administration and Jake Sullivan have restricted the arms use so that Ukraine cannot defend itself and fire back at Russia. That's why I mandated the ATACMS and the supplemental, the long range, short range, and the HIMARS, that your administration is tying their hands behind their back, not unlike what you're trying to do in Israel. Will you change this policy so Ukraine can fight without one hand tied behind its back?
Well, as you...
Right, well, we don't need to hear any more from Mr. Blinken. We will remove that clip. I play it really for just educational purposes to show you that this is a common talking point. When you've got Boris the Clown, you've got Keane, you've got McCall, there's half a dozen other Republicans all saying the same thing across the course of this week. You have to raise the question as to, well, what is going on? And the truth is, well, there's a couple of levels to which it works on. The first is just quite simple. When it comes to the American Republican Party, it is opportunism to a large degree. The Democrats used the delay, as they claimed, Trump's delay in shipping weapons to Ukraine back in 2019 to launch an impeachment on Trump. And now the Republicans, presumably at Trump's direction or instigation, are looking like they're going to try and do the same thing to Biden over the delays to supposed delay, but not actual delay, of weapons shipments to principally Israel, which is the thing that, of course, they're getting really antsy about. But now they're throwing in Ukraine as well. So simple political opportunism is part of it. The much bigger and more important reason, though, why this is coming up now and why they're all saying the same thing is because they're running around in a panic, or I should say the policymakers, because the people you just saw are not policymakers. They're actors on stage. The policymakers from the think tank world, from academia, etc., are all getting worried about the Russian advance in the Kharkov region. They're getting worried about the fact that Ukraine's forces are becoming increasingly threadbare. They're even more worried about the fact that the legitimacy of a certain Vladimir Alexandrovich Zelensky is becoming, well, it's disappeared. His credibility and his legitimacy have gone. He is now, of course, over the last 5 days, no longer a president who has a formal mandate, but he is a president in name only, a president by dint of the fact that he has introduced martial law into Ukraine. So for all those reasons, they are getting increasingly worried. And when they get worried, what do? Well, they go on a PR offensive. That's one thing they do. They are trying to shore up the legitimacy of Zelensky. They are trying, of course, also to make sure that the war is prolonged and that the strains that are appearing on the Ukrainian forces don't go to breaking point too soon. So part of what this is a desire to delivering the weapon systems will make no difference. I doubt that any of the trio of idiots you just heard talking would be aware of that fact. But the more serious people know very well that if they deliver more ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, if they deliver more Patriot air defense systems, if they deliver the F-16s, the long-promised F-16s, which the Danish promised and then they didn't turn up, the Dutch promised and then they didn't turn up, the Americans are apparently training a cohort of F-16 pilots taken from Ukraine for training in the United States, but they're not ready yet. And as we have covered extensively before in this program, a 50-year-old aircraft, even though it has been updated, that the Russians have had decades to study, isn't going to prove much of a threat to the Russian air defense system and the Air Force. So what is going on is that they are trying to bolster Zelensky. They are trying to come up with something big, some big strike into either, well, Crimea doesn't really do it anymore because they've hit Crimea on numerous occasions and it hasn't really made any difference. They're trying to come up with some big strike on either a Russian economic or military target inside mainland Russia, pre-2022 Russia, shall we say, with the idea being that they don't seriously expect that to change the course of the war. However, if they manage to blow up something big, so if they hit some Air Force base or if they hit some energy facility, I doubt they'll allow the Ukrainians to go after an energy facility, though, for the reasons that Blinken and Austin objected to the last time, which is that the oil price cap has completely failed, and if they damage Russian energy production, it'll have a negative impact on the international oil markets. And they don't want that in an election year, the cynical bastards that run the Biden White House, that is. So they'll probably go after a military facility. They'll want to have something big blown up. Why? Do they expect that to change anything? Do they expect that to actually affect the way the war is going? No, they don't. What they want to do is to have a big explosion, quite literally in this case, that Zelensky can then put on TV. They can package up and put on the nightly news in Ukraine and elsewhere. They can show to all the congressmen and the moronic British MPs and say, look, Ukraine is winning. Look, Ukraine strikes deep into Russian territory. Putin is cowering. You can imagine the headlines in the slobbering, moronic British press if they hit an Air Force base in Russia, or if they hit a major military installation or something. They will then sort of launder that through the press and do a weekend's worth of shows about it. Zelensky will get his extra special Coke delivered to him to pep him up again. He'll go out there saying, see, we're winning, we have struck deep inside the heart of Putin's fortress. Putin is soiling himself and hiding in a bunker and crying. That's what they're after. They don't seriously expect that launching a load of ATACMS missiles on a military facility in, like, I don't know, the Belgorod region or something like that is going to produce a change in the war. What they hope is that it'll produce a change for the political fortunes of Zelensky, bolster his rule, maybe get some better favorabilities going for him, so that the press ganging operation, the mobilization in Ukraine, can maybe go a little bit better. I mean, that's one of the things they've got to be concerned about, the fact that this is going down so badly, and give a boost to the morale of the Ukrainian forces, the flagging morale of the Ukrainian forces. So this is a smoke and mirrors job. This is a PR campaign. And it's, of course, no coincidence that one of the people fronting it up is Boris Johnson, who at least can speak without a script. The denizens of the US Congress, slightly less so. So that's what the intention is here, to give a PR victory to Zelensky, principally. And they don't seriously expect any more that somehow, because they blow up an oil facility, if they do that, or more likely blow up a military facility with Western supplied missiles, that's going to cause a collapse in the Russian state? No, just simply not going to happen. The only thing that they are looking to do is, as I say, bolster the rule of Zelensky, secure him in place for another 6 months or so, perhaps. Make sure that the mobilization in Ukraine perhaps proceeds a little bit smoother, and try and spin out the war, because that is their only tactic left. That is their only way forward now. They know very well that they can't possibly win, so they're going to, as I've said before, try to spin the war out as long as they possibly can, at an unbelievably high cost, human cost, to Ukraine. So whenever, I will emphasize this again, whenever you see some moron on the television, or you hear somebody babbling on about how we've got to support Ukraine, they're not, of course, supporting Ukraine. They never have been. They weren't supporting Ukraine in 2004 with the so-called Orange Revolution, which brought in, of course, Yushchenko, the banker and puppet of the US. They weren't supporting Ukraine in 2014 when they staged the coup with the Banderites as the muscle. And they weren't supporting Ukraine when they turned it into an outsourced military encampment run by US imperialism, for the specific purposes of course, waging this war that they hoped would play the crucial part in their long-planned operation to collapse the government headed by Putin. They weren't supporting Ukraine for any of that, and they're not now. They're essentially prepared to condemn hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians to die, millions of Ukrainians to die. There's no limit on the casualties that the likes of Lindsey Graham, Boris Johnson, Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz are prepared to see Ukraine have inflicted upon it. As long as Ukraine keeps fighting, they don't care. They don't care. The entire male population of Ukraine could be killed in this war, for all they care. And they'll dust their hands off and move on to Taiwan, because that's really what Ukraine is doing, as Lindsey Graham said, as Boris Johnson said in that clip we played just now, is the best investment in our security. And Boris, again, because he's not got a job these days other than being a sort of professional spokesman for British imperialism, he was always that, but now he gets to do it without pretending to be an elected representative anymore. Well, he gave it away quite recently when he says it's about preserving Western hegemony, meaning mainly American and thus by extension British hegemony. And he's given the game away there, just as Lindsey Graham gave the game away when he said it's killing Russians, it's the best money we've ever spent, best investment we've ever made. And so they're quite clear in what they expect from Ukraine, and they're quite clear why they're investing in Ukraine. And the Azov lads are heroes because they're the muscle for this operation. They're the ones who are running the blocking units behind the front lines, making sure the Ukrainian front line can't retreat and can't surrender without being shot in the back. That's what they're heroes for. It makes me laugh when you see Boris Johnson praising Azov, because of course Boris would probably tell you in vivid and animated terms how the actions that Stalin, as lied about comprehensively by Anthony Beaver in the book Stalingrad, where Beaver, following conquest, alleges that the evil Soviets put the NKVD behind the front lines and shot dead up to 1 million men who were trying to retreat. Of course, it's a complete fantasy, a complete lie, complete bullshit. Boris Johnson would agree with all of that and say, it's terrible, my God, Stalin, the monster. But of course, they now do exactly that. They have made the lie that people like Conquest and people like Beaver and people like Douglas McGregor repeat over and over again. They've made that lie into a reality, because that wasn't how the Red Army behaved. It is, however, how this outsourced, fascist-run military is controlled. And so that's why Azov are heroes, because they're the muscle for British imperialism these days. And that's why Boris is there praising them. It's why he got a photo taken with them, waving the Azov eagle. So when I say Boris the Banderite, I'm slightly joking, because Boris Johnson is fundamentally a liberal. But then again, what is a liberal? Let's revisit the old phrase, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds. So given that essentially in Britain and in the United States, most politicians are one variety of liberal or another. They're just slightly different colorations of them. So the truth in the phrase, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds, comes in the fact that the liberal bourgeois becomes a fascist, of course, at times when he believes his profits, his property, are under threat. And this is particularly true if it is under threat from the organised working class. But it's also true if they see their hegemony, as Boris put it, under threat overseas from anti-imperialist forces. So they are more than prepared to turn to the forces that are arranged on fascist lines, that are would be described as Salafist in origin, more than prepared to employ the services of organised crime in order to preserve that hegemony internationally. And they're prepared, ultimately, to turn to, in our case, modern-day Oswald Mosleys, if they feel under threat from the domestic working class. And so reason why a liberal turns into a fascist is because, of course, fascism is the most violent reassertion of the power of the bourgeois, of the class rule of the bourgeois, when it is under threat from the domestic working class in particular. And so fascism is a violent, as I say, violent reassertion of the power of the bourgeois, which is expressed via the smashing of working class organisation and the creation of a dictatorial military police dictatorship, which is, of course, reinvigorated by bringing in radicalised petty bourgeois to act as the foot soldiers for it. And so the good liberals, of course, will either join this openly, and many of them will wring their hands but quietly get on with their roles behind the scenes as the fascists stick the boot in on the working class and go on the offensive in the sphere of international relations, shall we say, creating wars, reasserting the control of imperialism. So when you scratch the liberal, the fascist bleeds, because the good liberal is only ever 2 steps away, or one bad day away from being a fascist. And that's not just the case with the likes of Boris Johnson, who is rather more obviously inclined towards fascism. It's also true for the left liberals as well. Remember that, of course, the German Social Democrats employed the services of the proto-fascist Freikorps to kill Leibniz and Luxemburg and crush the German Revolution. And so, whether it's left or right liberalism, they're all only 2 steps away from fascism at most. 1 step away in the case of Boris. But the Social Democrats, the Social Democratic leaders in particular, are also only ever a few steps away from fascist collaboration. Again, look at the German SPD after World War One. Look at a lot of the Social Democratic parties in Eastern and Central Europe after World War Two, where when faced with the advancing power of Popular Front governments, many of them turned to collaboration with the fascist remnants, such as what happened in Hungary, what happened in Poland. Many of the social democratic leaders in those countries turned to open collaboration with fascist elements to try and prevent the creation of the people's democracies. So this is the reality of fascism. It is merely the most extreme form of bourgeois rule. Most of the bourgeois leadership will happily turn to it if the time comes when they feel like they need it. And so that's why you can accurately say that liberalism is only ever 2 steps removed from fascism. It is, again, it's the rule of the bourgeois with all the facades dropped, basically. And so for Boris Johnson, this is something that he will openly flirt with. For the likes of Keir Starmer, it's something he'll flirt with behind the scenes, perhaps, or maybe openly. But for the likes of the left liberals, the likes of the people who sort of cluster around the Guardian newspaper, what should we make of them? Well, fascism isn't just, of course, the guys with the bald heads. Oh, hang on. Screaming about blood and soil shit. It is also, of course, rabid forms of chauvinism. And there is, of course, no more a collection of rabid chauvinists than left liberals. You know, the people on the right, the open foot soldiers of fascism, will scream about blood and soil and King Arthur and various other sort of pseudo-Nordic and Celtic mythologies. The left liberals are no less chauvinistic, though. And I think this is something that I didn't understand myself until relatively recently. I understood on one level, on a theoretical level, about what chauvinism in the West means, but I didn't really see it up close until the Russia war, until the war on Russia began. There you saw the liberals openly expressing a form of rabid chauvinism, rabid pro-Western, particularly pro-Anglo-American chauvinism that was, I don't know if it was surprising, but it was certainly eye-opening. It was certainly eye-opening in terms of what these people were capable of, and how close these people are, in fact, to the blood and soil fascists that they often decry. When you look at the likes of people like Jonathan Steele and others in The Guardian, George Monbiot as well, those who start babbling about the values of the West and the need to stand up to the villainous Asiatic hordes. They don't say that often, but they say the tyrannies, the Putin's tyranny, Putin's distinctly Russian and Orthodox tyranny, etc., etc. They're going into territory which is barely that much different from the open fascists. You read the articles and the journals of the liberals these days, and again they're very, very close to the fascists in terms of their rabid belief in British and American, in particular, civilizational supremacy. And you can see this also with their backing of Israel, though that's becoming a little bit more difficult for them these days. It's a very difficult sell for them. But if you look into the people who are still openly pro-Israel, who would describe themselves as liberals, the civilizational supremacism angle is very much present with the pro-Israel crowd too. They are a very rabid pro-imperialist types who, again, are very close to the sort of Tommy Robinson EDL fascist types, which is why the EDL and various other sort of fascist knuckle-draggers turn up on pro-Israel demonstrations. Are they there because they love Jews? No, they're there as foot soldiers for imperialism, which is basically what they are. So this is a reality, which is that all of these characters, because imperialism is in crisis, they are all expressing their most rabid sensibilities more and more openly now. The civilizational supremacist element, the more and more nakedly racist elements, the more and more pro-fascist elements coming to the surface as imperialism slides deeper and deeper into crisis. And as to what this will do, they will get their way, of course. The Biden administration will openly say that the Ukrainians are free to do anything they want, to pursue the war however they want. They won't come out and explicitly say, go strike targets deep in Russia. They will say that Ukrainians can defend themselves in whatever manner seems best for them. That's what they'll say. And of course, that's their way of retreating again in a very cowardly fashion if things go wrong. If it all goes wrong and like Zelensky, I don't know, hits or the Ukrainians, I should say, Zelensky's not doing the work, the Ukrainians hit something vital or hit something which triggers a massive Russian response, then it'll be, that was Zelensky. My God, look at the guy, he's crazy. I mean, we never said he should do that. We just said that they should defend themselves without limitations. We never said that he should attack this oil pipeline or this Air Force base. You know, it'll be issued in a way which gives the lawyers in the Biden administration a way to retreat from it again. But they're going to give the permission. And of course, it won't do any good for the Ukrainians. It'll just be used as PR for Zelensky. Zelensky, the great leader. Zelensky has struck deep into the Russian territory. He has struck fear into Putin, who has retreated to a nuclear bunker in Siberia in fear of the wrath of the great actor, etc., etc. Of course, this will only mean that at best, the war carries on for another few weeks, another few months. But to reiterate the point, that is all they're looking for. It's all the imperialists are looking for now, to delay the inevitable. And because once the collapse really does come, and we haven't even entered into the major Russian offensive as yet. The Russians are just moving slowly into place up around Kharkov, but something is clearly in the works, though quite when it will start, we don't know. But I've gone through enough of this analysis for now. So what I will do is I will now greet those of you who are in the chat and start to take questions. So we have with us tonight Tobias, good evening to you. Albert is with us, as is Banana Bender, who says good morning from the other end of the world. Ian Foster, good evening to you, comrade. Jeremy asks, for the sake of myself and other ignorant Americans, could you tell us the titles of those beautiful, most inspiring ballads? Many thanks. I will place a track listing up on the website, and the full track, the full tracks are going to go up on the Patreon page soon. Yu Wan joins us from Phoenix, Arizona. Tim Gray, good evening to you. Martin, good evening to you. President Jesus joins us from California, the land of future Emperor Gavin Newsom. We are greeting Otis, who joins us from the Democratic People's Republic of Tyne and Wear. Beautiful place. I'm up in the northeast quite soon, actually, at the Durham Miners Gala in, must be about, 6 or 7 weeks away, just after the election. Alan Gordon joins us, as does Davey, as does Marrow Mind, who is coming to us from Liverpool, and Mike Martinez is with us. Heidi is with us, as is Jason, and go and check Jason's new blog out. It's called The Middle Age Revolutionary. He's written a couple of good pieces on there on the state of British railways and another one on the election announcements. Naylor, good evening to you, comrade, as I greet also the man with the greatest name on the internet, Dingo Ate Me Baby. Kevin joins us from Sligo in the Republic of Ireland. Alex Oliveira joins us. Newskin says, feel sorry for actual Borises, like actual Karens. Not a lot of actual Borises around. You'd think there'd be more of them. Otis says, Friday funnies, comrades. Why is it always hot in the corner? Because it's 90 degrees. Drum roll for our friend with the joke there. Good stuff. Dennis Curry says, happy Friday, comrades. Jawed says, evening, comrades. Feels like this is the weakest the British Labour Party has ever been. Let's shatter some imperial dreams. Fine sentiments indeed, and we'll be back covering the election next week because there's some really uninspiring garbage going on. Chris Casseroles joins us from Londinium, in the north of Londinium. Luca is with us. Good evening to you. Isidore says evening, and I say evening back. Peter is with us, my fellow dweller in perfidious Albion. Beju, good evening to you, comrade. Dennis Curry says, Boris the Banderite spider thinks he's Churchill. Well, he's a bargain basement Churchill. I suppose he's entirely consistent in some ways, because Churchill backed a Banderite insurgency in the Soviet Union, and now Boris is doing a sort of pound shop revival of all of that, to just as hideous an effect, in fact, even more hideous an effect. Kent joins us from Minneapolis. But Alex Oliveira says, if it wasn't for Boris, this conflict would have ended in 2022. Well, true. We should always bear in mind, though, that Boris is just a performer. Just like Boris is his stage name, he was going there to Kiev in 2022 with a message from the US imperialists. He wouldn't have done it on his own. He was going there to give Zelensky orders that came from Washington. That, of course, he wholeheartedly agreed with, but we should always remember who the ringmaster is of this particularly blood-soaked circus. Tim Gray says, haven't Tories always flirted, wined and dined with fascism behind closed doors? It is just now they are stupid enough to allow themselves to get recorded on video. To reiterate my point, I mean, you're right. There's been plenty of crossover from the Tories to the fascists. There's also been plenty of crossover with the Labour Party and the fascists. If you examine some of the characters who've been in the Labour Party over the years, if you examine a character like, for instance, Lee Anderson, he's a sort of pet hate for the left, but for good reasons this time. Now, Lee Anderson is this vile, anti-worker, despicable arsehole who is, because he's from a working class background, like he was a coal miner at a certain point in his life. He spent a long time in the Labour Party, but he's always been that kind of hideous scab sellout scumbag, and he always basically views himself as superior to other working class people, that he's like some sort of great hero who deserves to be placed at the top of the tree. And when he couldn't get his way in the Labour Party, he walked out of it, joined the Tories, never changed his views fundamentally. And if you look at him now, he's on TV. He's now joined the Reform Party. Tories were, of course, not enough for him. He's now joined the Reform Party, and he's basically got a TV career where he sounds like a sort of British version of a Fox News commentator. And a guy like that is a despicable, chauvinist, anti-worker piece of garbage. He'd fit right into a fascist party, and he spent most of his political life in the Labour Party. Like, he joined the Tories and didn't change his views. He joined Richard Tice and Nigel Farage's outfit, Reform, and didn't change his views there either. So, yes, the Tories have had a good deal of crossover with fascist organisations. The Labour Party has too. And it comes, in our case, in the British case, from us being an imperialist country. If you look at, I mean, I've been to Labour Party meetings, which are every bit as like horrific and chauvinistic as anything the Tories have got to offer. And again, it all stems from us being an imperialist power and the rabid chauvinism that is instilled in people, even in the working class, certain elements in the working class, particularly the Labour aristocracy, comes out all the time and gives fertile ground to fascism whenever it needs to grow, because all the political institutions promote or should we say, they cultivate the foul soil it needs to grow in, and that particular soil is the soil of imperialism, should we say. Isidore says, no, they have always been shameless. That's true. They just used to not video themselves being shameless. CJ says, greetings from a wet Richmond, Virginia. Well, it's been pissing down here, so I don't see why you lot should be spared across the other side of the Atlantic. Heidi says, don't worry, I'm sure they're just moderate Nazis. Hey, we all love a moderate rebel, you know. Abtin, good evening to you. Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk, says, Putin, Belousov and Yanukovych were here in Minsk today. Something very big is in the offing and won't be good for the cokehead in Kiev. Thoughts? The inclusion of Yanukovych is an interesting one. I assumed that he was retired or a spent force, but I know there is a Ukrainian government in exile. I think it's headed by, or as a prime minister in exile is a Mykola Azarov, I believe. Irish Partisan can correct me if I'm wrong on that one. So the inclusion of Yanukovych is interesting because it points to some potential outcomes here. So why bring Yanukovych into the equation? Well, is it the case that Putin and Lukashenko, who clearly do a lot of planning together, are cooking up an end game scenario here? Because if it was the case that eventually the Russians stretch the Ukrainian armed forces in the east from Kharkov all the way down to Zaporozhye region and Kherson region. If they stretch them to the point where they break, and then there is perhaps a rapid collapse, and it enables the Russians to sweep down, taking out the remaining Ukrainian forces in and around Kiev, around the Belarusian border first, of course, sweep down to Odessa, possibly link up with Transnistria. That might be a final point as well. And then perhaps go all the way west. It would make it easier to go all the way west if, of course, they weren't directly taking over the running of the state of Ukraine. Now, could it be that the reason why Yanukovych is involved at all is that what they are planning is to restore a version of the Ukrainian constitution that existed prior to 2014 and a version of the Ukrainian state that existed prior to 2014. I think Yanukovych and restoring him into office might be their way of essentially saying that we don't regard the post-Maidan government as legitimate. We don't regard anything it did as legitimate. And therefore, we are restoring the pre-2014 constitution and president. It's an interesting one, this. Because I don't think that Yanukovych actually lost that election in 2004. It was stitched up to give it to Yushchenko. And of course, part of the stitching up was done by that foul old crook, Leonid Kuchma, who's still knocking around, I believe. And he was involved with the Zelensky administration for a while. So bringing in Yanukovych when they've finished the military job, and if they're bringing in Yanukovych, to me it says that they're going to go all the way to the far west of Ukraine. They're going to take Lvov. They're not going to allow a Bandera stand to exist in the west. They're not also going to allow Poland and others to dismember the west of Ukraine. They're bringing in Yanukovych to essentially resume his term as president that was interrupted in 2014. That would be the only reason you would bring him in, I think. And are going to claim that once they've pacified things, once they've wiped out and mopped up the remnants of the Banderite forces and the various other holdouts and the various other forces that the NATO bloc has put into Ukraine, once they've done that, they will set up a civilian administration, possibly with Yanukovych, maybe Azarov, though he's a bit old, but maybe he'd do it, and some of the other exiled Ukrainians. They would set them up in Kiev. And this is why I think the fate of Kharkov is interesting, because now it's the case that certainly the four regions plus Crimea, the four regions that voted to go into Russia, will be staying in Russia. There's no doubt about that. The Kremlin can't reverse on that. It would be too politically damaging. But when it comes to Odessa, when it comes to the coast, when it comes to the link up with Transnistria, when it comes to Lvov, preserving a reconstituted Ukrainian state run initially at least by Yanukovych and the other exiled politicians who came from the east, and it being reconstituted explicitly under Russian control at first. I mean, we should remember how the Russians ultimately dealt with things in Chechnya, which is they militarily crushed the CIA and MI6 backed rebels, and they did so whilst bringing in Kadyrov's father, Akhmat Kadyrov, and then when he was killed, they gave the job to his son as head of the republic. So what they will be doing here, I think, and this gets around a lot of problems for them, which is they'll be re-establishing a civil administration in Kiev. They will make a legitimate case, legally speaking, and I think the fact that Putin likes to legally cross the T's and dot the I's on this, perhaps the case that Putin will make is that the government headed by Viktor Yanukovych was illegally overthrown in 2014. He may also say, because Putin's gone on record as saying this now, that the coup of 2004 was also illegitimate, of course, and the denial of the office of president in 2004 was also illegitimate. So we're restoring the original constitution of Ukraine, under which it became independent in 1991, and we're restoring the legitimate president who was overthrown in a coup in 2014. Now, that would be, for the Russian government, maybe a challenge, because, of course, there's an awful lot of water gone under the bridge since then, but a reconstituted Ukraine with access to the coast, with, of course, access to Transnistria, ruled by a civilian authority that could claim a good degree of legitimacy, given the fact that everybody in the global south, to use that phrase, can see what the coup job that was done on Ukraine. So leaving Ukraine with most of its land intact under a civilian administration, and then ultimately probably the reason why Yanukovych might be there is to agree to a Ukraine as reconstituted becoming part of a joint union state with Belarus. I mean, I think that's got to be the reason why you've got a joint meeting between him and Putin and Lukashenko, is that, I mean, there was talk, I mean, many years ago. Incidentally, it's the 27th anniversary of the signing of the Union State Treaty between Belarus and Russia, all the way back in the days of Boris Yeltsin. So I think that's the reason why Putin, Lukashenko, and Yanukovych are meeting. It's the plan probably being put together for the post-war Ukraine. It's probably going to involve the Russians initially taking all of Ukraine, pacifying it, then bringing in Yanukovych to institute essentially a version of the 1991 constitution, with, of course, the regions that voted to join Russia gone. But I think, then this is crucial, Kharkov will possibly remain part of the reconstituted Ukraine. I mean, that might be something that they're considering as well. And Odessa remains part of a reconstituted Ukraine, perhaps, but of this reconstituted Ukraine will be very strictly under the control, initially, of the Russian military authorities. They will vigorously hunt down and destroy all of the Banderist organizations, all of the leading Banderite terrorists, all of the NATO formations that have stayed behind, and they will not, of course, withdraw their forces or draw down on the military occupation until they are convinced that the new Ukraine has been stabilized. And the new Ukraine will, of course, be then turned over to civilian authorities under Russian supervision until the Russians are confident that it can stand on its own 2 feet. Of because there'll have to be an awful lot of money spent putting this thing back together again. But again, bringing in the formally internationally recognized president who was overthrown in a coup to oversee re-establishment of a Ukrainian state, albeit without the regions that have now left, well, that would be a way of undoing several potential difficulties that the Russians are facing. It would also encourage, to a degree, I think, a lot of Ukrainians to come home, because the way that they I think there are a lot of Ukrainians who have fled to the West. If the country revives, many of them might go back. I mean, there's a hell of a lot of tension between the Ukrainians and the Poles that can't be pleasant to live in. And so if they re-establish civilian authority and get the economy working again, start rebuilding it, I imagine the Chinese will want to invest quite a bit in it. It's a very good business opportunity for them. It's, and again, like an excellent opportunity for linking to, via the Danube, linking to Serbia, linking to Transnistria, etc. So again, the three sisters, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, signing a new union state treaty, binding them all together, having a joint defense area like Russia and Belarus have, having a Ukrainian army that's reconstituted and integrated into a union state organization. Well, all of that solves, or potentially solves, quite a few problems for the Russians. Hello from Brighton, says HM. Can you do a Galloway impersonation? Maybe. I'll think about that. It's not a request show, mate. Okay? Maybe you'll get one before the end. Maybe you won't. I like to keep you guessing. Right. Muniz joins us from the Kingdom of Denmark, soon to be a republic, I hope. Is that on the cards? Do let me know if it is. Steve Choate says, I'm so sick and tired of the United States. Do you live in the United States? Yeah, there is an old Clash song, I'm so bored of the USA, which might be appropriate. Martin asks, isn't Marjorie Taylor Greene still anti-Ukrainian? Is she isolated now? These Lindsey Graham types are utterly unprincipled slime. Well, MTG is an interesting one. Maybe we should get her on the programme, though I doubt she'd come on a Marxist programme. I'd have to rebrand myself the Patriot Hour and do my Alex Jones impersonation to get her on, I think. But I think her and her group lost. Whatever. And I think, by the way, they lost because Trump sold them out. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, Chip Roy, Lauren Boebert, and the other fun types in the Republican Party, and I say the word fun, not in irony or sarcasm. There, it's they seem like a laugh. Those people got shafted by their own boss. Like, the reason why the Republican Party has, I think the reason why a lot of them flipped from like speaking against this to going all down the Lindsey Graham route was because basically Trump did a deal with Lindsey Graham and ultimately the Democrats to unblock the Ukraine aid in return for, well, maybe the deal wasn't with the Democrats, but certainly with the Democratic Party hierarchy. The deal was with Lindsey Graham and the various elements in the American, in the State Department and Department of Defense, who the Trump supporters would refer to as the deep state. I think Trump's, as I said on Telegram, he's done a deal with them. He's done a deal with them to, he hopes, keep them off his back in his second term. That's what he's hoping. That he's essentially sold out his own supporters in the House of Representatives. He's openly shafted them. He's gone along with Lindsey Graham to push for greater military packages to go to Ukraine. And Marjorie Taylor Greene and the others are now left essentially pissing in the wind. And what they're going to do now, I'm not sure. But they're certainly now isolated, and it was Trump that isolated them. Because as soon as he flipped, the Republican Party all went with him. And as Michael Tracy has pointed out, correctly in this case, I mean, Tracy's got his various obsessions and eccentricities, but his reporting on the congressional toings and froings is usually very good. he made the correct point, which is MAGA now just means literally personal loyalty to Trump. That's all it means. There's nothing else it stands for. And so now Trump thinks, well, I've let them have all these weapons. They said send the weapons, and I've sent them. Maybe they'll leave me alone. Maybe they'll drop the court cases. I don't know. And that'll be his calculation. And so I think a deal has been done. The only people who don't know, or pretending not to know, are the lower ranks of the sort of the activist bases of both parties. So both the MAGA people and the Democratic Party base are, of course, getting scammed by Trump and the Democrats because the deal's been done. The MAGA guys and girls who think that Trump's fighting the deep state, they've been scammed. Why wouldn't Trump scam them? He scammed everybody else in his career. And the DNC type MSNBC viewers, they're getting scammed too, because again the deal's been done. They will continue to enact the circus, of course, because this is good for both sides in the election. It's good for Biden to go, Trump's a fascist, and it's good for Trump to say, you know who they fear? It's me. They're terrified of me. I'm coming for them. You got to back me up against the deep state, folks. It's terrible. And yeah, the MAGA people and the DNC people have yet again been scammed, just as the DNC, just as the left and the left of the Democrats was scammed by the Squad and by Bernie Sanders. So the people on the right have been scammed by Donald Trump. Why would it be any other way? Sean Moon asks, do Americans realize the consequences of NATO weapons striking inside Russia? Well, they do, and they don't care, because they've calculated that what will happen is that Ukraine gets hit harder, and they don't care one jot about what happens to Ukraine. Songs 4K says, one military summary channel says they've hit Russian radar stations with drones. Well, they've done that before. To complete Songs 4K's comment, he says, that's strategic nuclear defense, raising the stakes for Russia. Yeah, they've done that before. The Russians will continue on with what they're doing now, because what they're doing now is working. The one hope, perhaps, that the US and the British have is that if they start attacking Russian military installations, it'll like distract the Russians from what they're doing now. It won't. The Russian command know very well that the Ukrainians are cracking. They know very well that the US and the Europeans can't intervene to stop them, and they're going to keep doing what they're doing. And the ultimate punishment for the United States will be in losing this war. Now, they may, as others have said, choose to hit the United States elsewhere if things carry on this way. So they may choose to, for instance, enable the Syrians to chase the United States once and for all out of Syria. They may, though interestingly enough, the Israelis haven't been back, as far as I'm aware, to bomb Syria again since the incident where they bombed the Iranian consulate, and the Iranian response humiliated Israel. But they may give the Syrians the authority to, I don't know, they may, this would be a bit of a risk, but they may give the Syrians the authority to shoot down Israeli planes. That might be something that they could do. Or more likely, they would aid the Syrians or the Iraqi resistance in intensifying the targeting of the American bases in the north of Syria and dismantling the SDF, the Kurdish forces that work as proxies for the United States. There's a lot of options the Russians have with regard to turning up the heat on the US in various places around the world. Steve says, at least it has become clear to almost everyone over the past few years what all of us Marxists have known for years is the US is evil. Well, imperialism is evil, whether it's US or anybody else's. But you're right. Isidore says, can you say something about the origins of the British-US conflict with Russia? Together they seem to play a leading role in stoking the current conflict, not only in Ukraine but prominently in the Baltics. I recently learned that the British intervention in the Revolutionary War of 1917 led to the creation of the Baltic states as anti-Soviet client entities. bourgeois analysts always seem to draw parallels back to the Cold War, but it seems to me the Cold War was only a chapter in a series of attempts to crush Russia. Well, you're talking about several different periods here. The Revolutionary War, which you mentioned, that was a straight-up case of the imperialists waging an anti-communist crusade and setting up the Baltic states to act as essentially bases to attack the Soviet Union. So there is a tendency of some people to say, and comes from Russian state propaganda, that the Brits have been running this long-term campaign against Russia since like 1820 or something. And of course the Brits have schemed and plotted against just about everybody over that time. But the origins of this conflict are much, much later. The origins of this lie in 1992, 93, with the publication of the Wolfowitz Memorandum and the clear instruction in that memorandum or the clear policy aim that no powerful state should be allowed to emerge on the territory of the former Soviet Union ever again. That there was too many natural resources sat there and these needed to be under American control. Which is why they were, of course, backing the first and second Chechen wars in terms of backing the insurgents there. They were doing that even when Billy Boy Clinton was saying that Boris Yeltsin was his best friend. Oh, Boris, my good buddy. He and I have so much in common. But at the same time, as Putin has pointed out himself on a number of different occasions now, including in the interview with Tucker Carlson, they never stopped intervening in Russia. And that was, again, it's very deliberate. I mean, Kaya Kallas, as we were saying on the stream the other day, just gave the game away recently. She's just basically blurted out what they all say in private, that they need to break Russia up, and that need has been there since 1992, when they realized that, great, communism's gone, the Soviet Union's gone, we can institute a global counter-revolution now, other than in China, but it's still the case that the Russian Federation that survived was still too big. Now, they hoped that Boris Yeltsin and his crew of compradors would do a good job on destroying the country so that it would be too weak to rise again. But they miscalculated, and the balance of forces in Russia produced the Putin system, which they've always hated precisely because as soon as he got in, he solidified the central control exercised by the Russian state, which was enough to, of course, trigger all these people because they suddenly realized that their unlimited interventions into Russia and their attempts to break it up and leave it perpetually weak wasn't going to be tolerated. Now, of course, Putin is no revolutionary, so it took him a long time to get to the point that he and the ruling group are at now. But the rot did stop 20 years ago. So the origin of this war lies much more in the post-Cold War period, the 1990s. 92, 93 is the start of this modern iteration of the process. And I insist upon breaking up these periods because the reasons why the British were scheming or engaging a sort of shadow war with Tsarist Russia in the 1850s and 60s, and the reasons why they were attacking the Soviet Union consistently for 70 years, and the reasons why they're going after modern-day capitalist Russia are all different. Yes, there is the overarching aim, which is, of course, imperialism must dominate every resource and source of labor everywhere that can be exploited. But again, there's quite different reasons why the British are doing the things that they are doing at any given moment in time. With the Tsardom, it was all about securing continued control over India, of course, and also, of course, trying to extend their control into Central Asia. With communism, with the Soviet Union, it was all about, of course, destroying the Soviet Union as a source of global revolution, essentially, whether there was a Comintern there or not. This time, it's about breaking up what's left of Russia via the destruction of the Russian Federation, which has, of course, thankfully failed. And that is, of course, triggered by the crisis of British imperialism, which is much deeper now than it was in 1917 or like 1852. So that's my brief overview of the reasons for why the Brits are going after Russia in the way that they are. Potted Rodent says they're definitely squeezing every last ounce out of Zelensky before they toss him in the bin. Yeah. Whether Zelensky survives will be an interesting question. Ultimately, the decision will be made in Washington whether he serves them better as a sort of exiled guy on the chat show circuit, maybe doing his piano trick with Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart, or whether he serves them better as a martyr. That's a choice that he won't get to make, though. His paymasters will make it for him. Naylor says they're still going with their to the last Ukrainian policy. It's disgusting, indeed it is, but we would expect nothing less from them. Is this war expensive to the Russian economy? Asks Boyo. Well, they are spending more, undoubtedly, but of course the sanctioned regime has actually seemingly encouraged greater growth in the Russian economy over the last year or so, and with greater growth to follow this year. So I would say in some ways it's actually the capital controls that Biden slapped on Russia, the restriction in the ability of the Russian capitalist class to move its money around, the forcing of the issue with regard to state control over certain sectors of the Russian economy. All of that over the last 10 years, and particularly over the last 2, has really done the Russian state a great deal of favors. So it's actually something which is invigorating the Russian economy far more than it's costing them, I would say. Dennis says, Russia has improved to the third largest economy in the world, now passing Japan. Indeed. Grassy Knoll has joined us. Good evening to you. Sean asks, how many American military bases are there in Germany and Italy? Quite a few. I should really come back to the number of NATO bases around the place, actually. That'll be an interesting future program. Michael correctly says that McGregor lies about the USSR all the time. Yeah. He's full of shit when it comes to political history. Ian Foster says, fascism is what liberals turn to when their crisis becomes existential, when any part of the imperialist capital order is threatened. That's very true, of course. Abtin says, my claim is that McGregor is an ignorant reactionary, and that's also true. The Incompletist. The story of Boris' family wealth is the Who Do You Think You Are show. Was a Nazi tea service his grandmother had smuggled out of the Third Reich to England. Good old Boris. Songs 4K says, Locke would have made a good fascist, upholding religious supremacy at home and colonial expropriation abroad. Well, if you mean John Locke, that's why he's one of the founders of liberalism. Martin points out that John Locke wrote the South Carolina Colonial Slave Code. Yes, very true. Songs 4K says, the agony of NATO's retreat from Afghanistan exposed the liberal side of Western chauvinism. I think it was always there. Go back 150 years and look at their justifications for the so-called scramble for Africa. Look at how many liberals back then were calling for the British to take the lead in civilizing the dark continent. This has always been how they are. I think the reason why I saw it more and was slightly taken aback by it was because my politics had changed. Like when I was a Dumbo Trotskyite, I was probably still practicing forms of Western chauvinism myself. But when I was moving towards the Marxist-Leninist analysis, I began to see and understand the chauvinism a great deal more, I think. Boyo says, when this war started, there were Ukraine flags everywhere. Concerned me how quickly the population could be mobilized in support of the war. I would say it's a very passive mobilization, though. A lot of that was public buildings, and generally speaking, it was the petty bourgeoisie certainly sticking the flags up. Sticking a flag up in your window, that's a bit different than agreeing to be marched off into into certain death in Donbass. So a lot of people like to virtue signal in this country, particularly in the petty bourgeoisie. Ask him to strap on a gun and go and die in a ditch for Joe Biden. You might get a different answer, though. Mushkin says, is it reasonable to see anti-Semitism as a fetish for imperialism as opposed to actual anti-Semitism? Obviously. It's an ideological tool. They have taken up the Zionist appropriation of Jewishness, and they are using the Zionist definition to try and police discourse. That's what they're doing. Actual anti-Jewish groups and behaviors and individuals, they have no problem with. They're just simply using the Zionist definition of Jewishness to try and defend the colonial enterprise that is Israel. Just as, by the way, they will, of course, call their jihadist friends, the Salafists they employ, warriors for democracy, just as they will salute the Azov lads at the same time. I mean, all of this fits together because all of these are these are the ultra-reactionary foot soldiers of imperialism. Now, the Zionists get more advanced lies told for them, shall we say, because they have a more developed political project. And also it was somewhat respectable in certainly in bourgeois circles, very respectable in bourgeois circles, to be an open advocate of Israel for a long time. Whereas they were in a long-term alliance with the Banderites and the Islamic fundamentalists, the Salafists, it wasn't respectable and still isn't to come out and openly hail these people as like great leaders. It's becoming more acceptable now to do it for Bandera, as that's the reason why Boris won't be too bothered about that video coming out. But you can, of course, hail Zionism and hail Israel as this great sort of civilizing enterprise and still be regarded as a good, respectable bourgeois. That's another factor in this as well. Don't Americans understand what F-16 strikes inside Russia mean, asks Sean Moon. I think the Russians understand it pretty well. It means that those pilots you've spent the last year and a half training are all dead within about 3 days, if that, or 3 hours. So means absolutely nothing in terms of moving the dial for Ukraine. It'll just give Zelensky like a 2-hour PR window. That's it, nothing else. Naylor says, yeah, those blue and yellow flags outside and in people's profile pics aren't as popular as they were, although they still have a few over Downing Street. I was expecting them to change it to the Zionist flag. Well, they did superimpose the flag of Israel on the on Downing Street for a while, but again, that didn't prove too popular. So they kind of dropped that. Isidore says, I know exactly what you mean, not just Guardian journalists who I saw for a long time as servants of the ruling class. I was surprised by the British Liberals, petty bourgeois left-leaning types who might have opposed the Iraq war even, but now Putin is their second biggest concern after Trump. I think for some of them he's their biggest. I realised it is their unconscious class loyalty, or conscious in some cases. Greetings to Iris Crocus, who joins us from West Wales, and Lurtis, who joins us from a most perfidious Albion. Hello to Barbara, who's with us. Wayne Tables, what's up? Quite a lot. Barbara says, Trotskyism has clogged up leftist groups here in NYC. Well, Trotskyism clogs up activism everywhere. That's what it's employed to do. Trotskyism, as Stalin observed, has been a great service and a servant to the imperialist intelligence agencies since the 1920s and continues to be to this day. That's why we're doing our series entitled Stalin on the Opposition, where we examine the debates in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the 20s and hopefully expose Trotskyism in the process. Mr. Chopin joins us from the great Midwest of the United States. Jenny joins us as well. Good evening also to... no, I've missed one there. Something appeared and then disappeared on this chat screen. Songs 4K says Boris was just the most shameless con artist among the NATO lapdogs, so delivered the message to Zelensky. Yeah, if you want to employ a con man, employ Boris. Luca says, what's your view of Zara Sultana? Is she really challenging the Labour position on Gaza? No, she's not. My view on Zara Sultana, if you don't know who that is, Luca's referring to a Labour left MP, basically models herself after AOC. She's one of the MPs for Coventry, a city in the West Midlands of England. And of course, we've got an election coming up. So all of these Labour leftists who've been dissenting, so they would put it, over Gaza, over the Gaza war, and have now all turned around and say you have to vote Labour. You have to vote for the Labour Party and vote Labour in, even though it's led by not just one guy, but a lot of people who have backed up the genocide in Gaza. The genocide we've been denouncing is awful. We're going to now tell you to vote for a guy who was just as enthusiastic about it as Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak was. So Zara Sultana and the so-called socialist, so-called campaign, so-called group, led by that globulous fraud John McDonnell, are all a bunch of scam artists, because they aren't there to provide some sort of avenue to fight for socialism. They are there, much like good old Bernie and the squad are in the United States, to provide you with the illusion that you can advance socialist goals via voting for the Labour Party. They're there to sell you a lie, and they must be critiqued rigorously and exposed for what they are. Same with Corbyn. I mean, Corbyn's supposedly standing to be an independent, but his campaign's being run by a guy who describes himself as an ardent Zionist. And yet Corbyn is credited by the British left as being, oh, he's been on the side of Palestine for years. No, he hasn't. No, he hasn't. He was on the side of Palestine when it was convenient. When it became inconvenient, he dropped his commitment to the Palestinian struggle. As soon as the bourgeois press demanded it of him. And now he's running a campaign that's coordinated by a man who describes himself as an ardent Zionist. This is a scam. Corbynism was a scam. It's a scam that the ruling class got caught out by, because of course because it got taken up by so many people, it surprised them. But in the end, they brought it under control without too much difficulty. Because Corbyn himself was never serious about actually challenging the ruling class and fighting for any of the things he claimed to believe in. Look how quickly he dropped his old comrades. Look how quickly he dropped the commitments to the Palestinians. Look how quickly he bent over for every single piece of bullshit that the ruling class demand that he engage in. So he is perfectly representative of the Labour left, even though he's not formally in it anymore, in that his entire career has been built on a lie, which is basically pretending that he represents some path to socialism for the Labour Party, whereas in actual fact he's a very well remunerated scam artist who's been pretending to offer a path to socialism, but in actual fact has been telling people to vote for Neil fucking Kinnock, Tony fucking Blair, Ed fucking Miliband, and Keir fucking Starmer. And by the way, if Keir Starmer hadn't kicked him out, Jeremy Corbyn would be telling you to vote for him. So if you're, on the one hand, denouncing this horrible genocide, and on the other hand, you're telling everybody to vote for a man who has committed himself over and over and over again to continuing the alliance of British imperialism with Israel, continuing to politically back Israel, then what value is anything you've said? Nothing. The value of what Corbyn says is nothing. He's a scam artist, he's a liar, he's a fraud, and the sooner everybody realises that, not just him, but the entire Labour left are scam artists and frauds and are pro-imperialist as well, and always have been, by the way. The best you ever got out of the Labour left is watery pacifism. The Labour left in like the 40s and 50s were all rabid imperialists in favour of the increased exploitation of the empire in order to fund reforms at home. That's disgusting. I want and nobody else should want anything to do with that. And that's why I say Labour leftism has always been a scam. It's always been pro-imperialist. It's always been anti-worker when it comes down to it. These are people providing services to the bourgeoisie, and this particular service they provide is the lie that they have told people that socialism can be pursued through the Labour Party. It's a lie that they tell, the Communist Party of Britain tells, and the entire trade union bureaucracy tells as well. Fuck them all. Whew. Okay. Peter says, Alexander Mercurius today suggested that Prime Minister Starmer's instructions, not in any manifesto of course, is to clamp down hard on speech and public association. A big majority would embolden him. I think Starmer's instructions are much broader than that. What is being demanded of him by the ruling class, as I've said before, is a generalised sticking of the boot in on the working class and using the traditional Labour Party relationship with the trade union leaders to help make that more smooth than it would be if the Tories tried to do it. And a big majority must be something which he is denied. We absolutely must reject and publicly expose the reasons why both Starmer and Sunak's election sloganeering revolves around stability and strong government. Well, the reason why they want stability and a strong government is so that they can effectively carry out attacks on the British working class and, of course, engage in acts of imperialism overseas. And so they absolutely must be stopped. They must be denied a majority. We must deliver a result, or try to, in many ways we can, that does not give stability and security and strong government, but delivers the opposite of all of those things. The last thing we need, as I said on the election programme the other day, is a strong government headed by Labour or the Tories or anybody else in the bourgeois system. Putin cannot leave vacuum areas. NATO would take them, asks Dennis Curry. Yeah, I mean, I think they're going to go all over. I think they're going to make an advance all over Ukraine and crush all resistance. Then they'll set up, possibly, their new administration. Don't know whether Yanukovych will be a long-term option. He might head it as interim leader, sign some constitutional documents, as somebody else says in the chat, and then eventually they would have new elections. But I think that clearly there is a plan in place to reconstitute a Ukrainian state, but one that is bound into treaties with Russia. They'll have to repudiate Ukrainian debt. Yeah, I think what the Russians will do, given that the imperialists are trying to confiscate their assets that were stored in Europe, the Russians will just turn around and say, because the government that was produced after 2014, I mean, they may go all the way back to 2003, given that Putin's already mentioned it. They may say that the governments produced after 2014, certainly, have all been illegitimate. They've all been coup regimes. Neither Poroshenko nor Zelensky had the right to sign anything. So all of the deals that have been done with the Wall Street titans like BlackRock and Vanguard, and all of the debt taken on, is all invalid because it was all taken on by a illegitimate government. So we renounce the debt. I mean, what else can the West do to Russia now? They've already confiscated their assets. They've already slapped 1 million sanctions on them. If the Russians turn around and say, well, this new version of Ukraine ain't going to be paying back the debts that Poroshenko and Zelensky took on, and by the way, BlackRock's lost all its money in Ukraine, well, what else are they going to do to them? Nothing. So I think they will repudiate it, and it will all stem from their legal claim that everything that was done after 2014 was illegitimate because it was a coup regime. Still waiting for the Tom Perez impression, asks Irish Partisan. You may get it someday. Keep tuning in. Art Vanderlei, George, is that you? Because killers in America work 7 days a week. Indeed, they do. Clash reference there. Putin's political opponents inside Russia wouldn't tolerate Kharkov and Odessa remaining inside any version of Ukraine. They would immediately ask what was the point of the SMO. Well, Putin would tell them to denazify. He'll go back to the original point of the special military operation if he has to, and he'll say, we have achieved it. We've wiped out Banderism in Ukraine. Ukraine has been denazified. It has been demilitarized because we've destroyed the NATO army there. And that was the point of the special military operation. 4 new regions have joined Russia. Crimea has been secured. And we have destroyed all the NATO presence in the newly reconstituted Ukrainian state. That's what he'll say. And those opponents of Putin inside Russia, I mean, that case you're, excuse me, that case you're putting there comes from like the nationalist hardliners who aren't as strong as they would like to believe. They have a very strong online presence, and they immediately scream treason every move the Russians make, every move the Russian government makes. But I don't think they're that strong. I think if they reconstituted a version of Ukraine that had lost the 4 regions plus Crimea, of course, which has been gone for 10 years, and is essentially reset to its pre-2014 constitution, and then Putin will turn around and say, as he said before, the Ukrainians are a brotherly people who were sacrificed by fascists and NATO, and now we welcome them back into a new union with ourselves, which I think may be what he's planning, who knows. I think most Russians would accept that, but bear in mind, the biggest number of Ukrainian refugees fled eastward into Russia itself. So I think you're slightly overestimating the ultra-nationalist element there. I think the communists of the Russian Federation would accept that outcome, particularly, of course, if as would happen, the Communist Party of Ukraine resumed its operations, which it would. So the extremely online Russian super patriots would be very annoyed, but Putin would just ignore them. Dennis says, or asks rather, would you support referendums to bypass those oligarch idiots? What are you referring to there? Rare Tracy win? Yeah, asks Jenny. True. Michael says, I will not settle for Odessa and Kharkov left to Ukraine. Well, I'm going to be rather blunt about this. You're Irish, mate. You're not Russian and you're not Ukrainian. You need to bear in mind that Putin's position on Ukrainian statehood has always been a much more moderate one than is presented. Again, he will go back to if he has to, the original purpose of the special military operation, which is to chase NATO out of there. That's the overarching objective. To destroy Banderism, to destroy, ultimately, the regime that was put in place by the 2014 coup. I don't think that I mean, bear in mind, he would have taken a deal in 2022. In the end, he did the imperialists denied him one. And also turn to his essays prior to 2022, where he was talking about, he still talks about Ukrainians and Russians as brotherly people, and still talks about it to this day. He has never, nor have the Russian command, though they don't make political statements, nor the senior people in the Russian government, even Medvedev, who's the most sort of over the top, have never decried and attacked the Ukrainian people. They've attacked the Banderas. They've attacked Zelensky and his clique. They've attacked the Maidan coup plotters. They've never gone after and denigrated the Ukrainian people. And they've never, they said, Medvedev says this version of Ukrainian the state is over. Putin has sort of danced around that before. But they have a big problem, which is that Ukraine's massive. And what do you do with it all? You know, if you try and bring it inside the Russian Federation, that's going to be a big thing to swallow. Also, by recreating a version of the Ukrainian state and saying it's the true version of the Ukrainian state, not the Bandera Stan created by NATO, created by US imperialism, then Putin can say, well, I'm restoring Ukrainian statehood, not taking it away from them. He'll say, we restored a Ukrainian state, minus those areas that have voted to join Russia, and now Ukraine is going to be bound to us through a new union state treaty. The sacrifices that we made have been worth it, because it's all about denazifying Ukraine and chasing NATO out of there, and we've achieved that. So I think that's what he might say, if indeed this is the way they're going to go with it. Iris Croker says Trump brought in Bolton and Co. to keep them quiet, and that did not work. Well, he brought them in to secure his position in the Republican Party. He handed over control over huge areas of policy to Pompeo, Bolton, and others to essentially, again, secure his position. But also because, bear in mind, Trump's also a rabid chauvinist. Like, he gets credit for essentially, I mean, it was very funny seeing him beat up on Jeb Bush and various other sort of losers like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. But when you go back and you watch his 2016, 2015 debate performances and the things that he would say, he's saying a lot of the same stuff that Ted Cruz did. We're going to bomb them. We're going to bomb them so much. I will bomb them more than Ted. Ted doesn't like bombing people. I do. I'll be better at it. I'll do it so much better than little Marco. And like half the stuff he said contradicted the other half of the stuff that he said. He said, I'm going to get out of the forever wars. And he said, and I will end the wars better than, you know, I'll end it by being tough. I'll end it by doing more wars. I'll make sure that NATO's even stronger by forcing the Europeans to spend more on it. And of course, this produced a shit fit from the various liberals who, again, this all comes down to symbolism, to language, to proper form, to manners. That's what it all came down to with their objections to Trump. They didn't like him at the time because he was too crude. Now a lot of the ruling class are thinking that he's a good idea. And by the way, that's something that, I mean, not to blow my own fucking horn here or anything, but this is a prediction of mine that has come true. I said as early as 2021 that eventually the US ruling class might change their mind, or almost certainly would change their mind on Trump and start to see him as potentially a figure of stability, a figure of who could restore the legitimacy to a degree to the US political system by reinvesting people in it, by reinvesting both the MAGA types and the petty bourgeois leftists in the United States, by getting them to agree that to essentially continue their fake fights, their melodramatic fights that they had for between 2021 and between 2017 and 2021, and that would sort of reinvigorate the system, just as Trump's presence reinvigorated a dying bourgeois press. So they'll be hoping he can pull off some of the same tricks for them. That's why I think a deal has been done and everybody's quite pleased with it. The only people who haven't been told are the MAGA guys and the MSNBC liberals. After Ukraine, do you think Russia will try to do anything with the Baltic states? Not unless the Baltic states do something very stupid. I think they have no interest in them. I mean, bear in mind, Putin was president when the Baltic states joined NATO 20 years ago. So they've no interest in ruling fucking Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Besides, these are economic basket cases. Ukraine has serious economic potential. Why on earth would they want to go and claim ownership over the Baltic states? It doesn't make any sense. The only reason that they would be attacked is if they did something unbelievably ridiculous, like trying to launch some sort of stupid military incursion into Russia, or trying to start some sort of provocation in Kaliningrad or around Kaliningrad. They would have to be incredibly dumb to do that, though. And the people that run them are incredibly dumb, but maybe not that stupid. So no, I don't think that it will. I think that bear in mind, Baltic states, some of them at least, are still doing quite extensive trading with Russia. So everybody likes to forget that. More likely, what will happen is when the European Union plunges into crisis, so of course will the Baltic states, and then you'll be faced with domestic revolts in the Baltic states. That's probably what will happen. The Russians don't need to do anything. They just need to complete their business in Ukraine and then focus on whatever their outcome is going to be there. Baltic states will implode themselves within a few years. Boyo says Trump is Biff from Back to the Future when he owns the casino and is a billionaire. That's the alternate timeline we're in now. I must watch Back to the Future at some point. Joseph says people live in Transnistria do not use its Romanian name but call it Pridnesterovia. Okay, I will make a note of that. Dennis says after Ukraine, Putin will boot the Yankees out of Syria. I mean, that's probably coming. That's I think that's certainly on the Russian to-do list, but sooner rather than later. And they can do it without directly doing the fighting themselves. They can do it by supplying the Syrians with even more weaponry and, of course, aiding the Iraqi resistance as well. Sid Hatfield makes a good point in a book recommendation. One of the best sources regarding the counterinsurgency action from 18 to 21 is The Great Conspiracy Against Russia by Michael Sayers and Albert Kahn, published in 1946. Yes, I have a copy of that. Very good book. Funny, in 2018, Maria Zakharova hinted at Engels being close to British intelligence. Engels reckoned Russia was behind the Fenian bombings in 1885. Well, this is an old piece of bullshit that like Russian nationalists like to engage in. They've claimed at various stages that Lenin was a German agent, a British agent, an American agent, all of the above. So I don't take those claims that Zakharova makes particularly seriously. Right. Just trawling through. Sid says that video Jimmy Dore did on kidnappings of children, torture and mind control via McGregor was an obvious limited hangout revealing what the CIA does, but pointing fingers at the USSR. I haven't seen that. I don't watch the Jimmy Dore program because if you had that fucking arsehole Michael Malice on there the other day, God knows what that fucking God knows what that fucking prick was saying. Ian Foster says Labour left grifters everyone, career over principles. Very true. Ramsey MacDonald says A.J. Williamson, very pointing out the perfidious nature of the Labour Party. Ian Foster says that advisor to JC called himself a progressive Zionist. Anyone know an oxymoron that can beat that one? Community policing, comrade. Muskin says I fell for Corbyn. Well, look, there's no shame in making mistakes, mate. There's no shame in making mistakes. We've all made them. I was a Trotskyite for many years. I mean, think of how embarrassing that is. It's only a damaging mistake if you don't learn from it. And that's what we're all here to do. We're all here to learn from the mistakes that we've all made. It's all part of the learning process, you know, part of the healing and growing process, to use a new age phrase. Sid says, I'll just say it, it's his right-hand man, Kurt. I think he has been planted on Jimmy's show. Planted by who? Interesting question. Naylor says, you should clip that bit on Corbyn being a hack, because a lot of people here need to hear it. Interesting point. I'll go back and watch this tomorrow and see if I can clip that. Thanks for the suggestion. Luca says, you're 100% right about denouncing the chauvinism in the Labour Party, and I can confirm that the level of political education inside Labour is abysmal. I can as well. I mean, the politics of the people inside the Labour Party, as I talked about in a conversation I recorded a while ago with James Smith of the Popular Show, their politics are that they're Labour. It doesn't go beyond that. Their politics are, I'm in the Labour Party, I like being in the Labour Party, those Tories are bad, I'm voting Labour. That's where the political education ends. Michael makes a good point. Galloway dropped Palestine for RFK early on. Yeah. I think the Galloway, when it comes to getting people on his programme, has shown a degree of flexibility which I don't find particularly acceptable, to say the least. I think it's legit to say that there's a case to be made for voting for Workers' Party candidates in this election coming up, simply because the priority should be to try and deny the Labour Party a majority, and therefore we should, I think, encourage people to vote for Workers' Party candidates where possible. Again, the priority being that the Labour Party is the primary enemy, because they're the vehicle the ruling class has chosen at this particular moment, which is why they're being so relentlessly promoted. Sean Moon makes the right point. No libertarian can be trusted. Yeah. Well, I follow that New Hampshire libertarian account on Twitter, and those guys are basically just fascists who prefer a private police force. Just scrolling through the comments. Yeah, I mean, it's the reason why I don't watch like the Jimmy Dore show at all. I mean, I never trust comedians, never trust actors. It's two rules you always go by. And anybody who's got that big on YouTube, there's a reason why Jimmy Dore isn't banned. Because if he was the threat that he always loudly claims that he is, then he wouldn't have a show. They'd have shut him down. Really, I mean, let's be clear and obvious here. Let's be absolutely open. The reason why I'm allowed to do this and it's not banned is because the viewing numbers are small enough that the state can ignore me. And that's what free speech comes down to. If they think you're in a corner and they can ignore you, they'll let you get away with it. You know, if you've got 1 million viewers and you're live streaming to 20, 30,000 people like 5 nights a week or something, that's because they're letting you do it, and they're letting you do it because they're getting in messages on the show. And so old Jimmy is a conduit for anti-communism. That's what his purpose is. Stuart says, could Russia be taking a play out of the US book naming Yanukovych the legitimate president and refusing to acknowledge the now illegitimate Zelensky to make deals in advance with Yanukovych? Well, it would be an interesting move. I mean, there's a reason why they've kept him around. So I think that that's something that they're definitely looking at. We can expect an announcement on this fairly soon, I think. Maybe it'll be Putin on TV again, speaking with Yanukovych, saying, Victor, you are the legitimate president of Ukraine. Why don't you sign this, and this, and anything signed since 2014 is now illegitimate. I mean, I think that making that kind of legalistic argument would appeal to Putin's sensibilities. Sid Hatfield says, and Los Angeles has always been a hotbed of reactionary politics, even though it's portrayed as the home of the American left. I always thought that maybe since the 60s, but maybe Americans can correct me on this, I always regarded like Chicago and New York as like the historic base of the American socialist and later American communist parties. I always regarded those two cities as the place where the Marxism and before it sort of various forms of socialism grew up in the United States. Los Angeles and California, I think that's been more considered a home to the American left since, what, the 60s? But then again, I mean, California had Ronald Reagan as its fucking governor in the 60s, you know? So there's always been plenty of reactionaries there, as Sid says. I think it got a more radical reputation because I think the Black Panthers originated from, was it Oakland? And there was a lot of, I think the Revolutionary Communist Party, before they became just the Avakian cult, they originated from California. But to me, the home of American Marxism and communism has always been Chicago or New York. But Americans, I'm sure, will correct me if my assumption on that is wrong. Jenny says, I can't even bring myself to watch that Malice interview. I watched Michael Malice's interview on Joe Rogan. I mean, that was just a fucking absolute shitfest. Self-described anarchist with a career in the bourgeois media. Yeah, I know exactly what he's going to do. Not a pacifist says, I voted for Bernie and I joined the Labour Party. Again, life is a learning experience. Yeah, Jimmy Dore will end up endorsing that New Hampshire Republican account. I mean, he's already on tour with fucking, what's his name? Rob Schneider, Deuce Bigelow. Maybe old Jimmy's aiming for a part in the next Adam Sandler movie. They can do hilarious anti-DPRK skits together. Iris Crocus says, I explained to a relative who was a councillor and a former mayor and has no idea about the roots of the Ukraine conflict. In fact, he is a Tory on most subjects. I take it you're referring to somebody who's in the Labour Party. Speaking of comedians, asked Luca, what do you think of Lee Camp? Used to watch his programme, started to find him unbearable quite some time ago. To be honest, I mean, I find the trend of like comedians doing political shows, it's mostly unbearable anyway. And like Lee Camp and some of the others was way too quick to jump on like certain things and promote it. Like I think Lee Camp was like a big COVID hysteric, and he's like promoted that another former sideman from the Jimmy Dore show, Graham Elwood, who comes across as a complete fucking lunatic now. So no, I don't have much time for any of them, to be honest. I mean, they're still funnier than Russell Brand, but then again, so's nailing your foot to a plank of wood. What about the plagiarist Clay Morris? Don't know who that is, mate. Joining very late, says Morgan, who joins us from the Republic of Ireland. Glad to have shared the Johnson clip around many chats today. This is your ruling class. I've never known a more illegitimate ruling class in my lifetime. Well, this is all who they've always been. I'm sure you know that. But now they're just showing the advantage of the social media system, even though it is, of course, completely monitored and controlled by, well, not controlled by the state, but certainly heavily monitored by the state. The advantage is that these shitheads can't stop themselves now. 70 years ago, they would have never recorded their meetings with fascists. Never. Whether it was domestic fascists or fascism brought in from elsewhere. They'd have never talked about it. It would not have been recorded anywhere. You might have found a reference to it in like an exiled Banderist newspaper or something, but probably not even there. Nowadays, they're so casual about it because they're so arrogant, because they haven't had any serious opposition for so long. So it's good that they're being this arrogant and this foolish. It was revealing to me when Jimmy Dore said he'd been invited to the in the Grove. Oh, God. Do they all... Does anybody who works in Hollywood get the invite? I mean, I need to go and rewatch the Alex Jones clip. Oh, God. What a fucking joke. Limits of free speech, says Boyo, go as far as when you begin to connect with an audience. With a large audience. Then it gets limited. You know, if you're serious, you end up like Assange. You know, you reach a mass audience with certain things that were never meant for public consumption, that's when you get the Assange treatment or the Gary Webb treatment, if you're really unlucky. President Jesus says, I saw Crystal Ball say she's getting suppressed because she threatens capital. Whose capital? Kyle Kalinski's? If Crystal Ball is a threat to capital, then American capitalism's got some real fucking problems, you know. So what, it can't take Crystal Ball's warmed up reiteration of like DSA talking points from 2016? Well, if that's the case, then American imperialism is far weaker than I would have imagined. Stuart, glad you're enjoying the streams. Black Panthers came out of Oakland, California in the 60s, says Morrow. Ah, right, okay. Right, just trawling through the comments here. The only good political comedians were Carlin and Lenny Bruce. Carlin, I always appreciated. I mean, his sets were always a bit odd because, like, he'd have these, like, roaringly funny bits and then these bits that just don't work. Very up and down. But when he was on, that guy was brilliant. Lenny Bruce, never listened to much of his stuff. My dad told me that he saw him in London back in, like, the middle 60s or something. I'll have to ask him about what the set was like if he can remember it. Mr. Chopin says, Chicago was where the workers protested and where May Day came from. As I'm sure you're aware. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Morgan says, Jimmy Dore's bullshit meter is not good. It requires a lot of hindsight. Yeah. Alex Jones of Stratford, another Intel operative. Stratfor. Well, Alex Jones was in Stratfor? That's interesting. I always regarded Alex Jones as an actor, basically. Quite a funny actor. I mean, he acts quite hilarious in many respects, but yeah, certainly an actor. Crystal is worth $40 million. Maybe she's just asking for a pay rise. Crystal Ball's a threat to Cal Kalinski's wardrobe. Is she the one who came up with the idea of him dyeing his hair that colour? Makes him look like a fucking a twig that's been dunked in a bucket of bleach. I wouldn't call him political necessarily, but Louis C.K. is funny. I have watched some of his specials in the past. He was quite genuinely funny. Tim Dillon, I think, is the greatest stand-up working today. He's incredibly funny, and he's a lot sharper than the rest of them as well. He can get his audience to listen to quite radical things because he has a very good way of dressing things up. Like, he did this really fucking funny parody of the Israeli Eurovision song the other day, which was hysterical. Way funnier than any other comedian working at the moment. And his like some of the clips of him, like when he's like taking apart like the Ellen DeGeneres show, that's hilarious. Yeah, he's definitely the best comedian working in the United States at the moment that I'm aware of, anyway. Okay, so we have been going for a couple of hours now, so I think I will bring things to a close for this evening. Thank you to all 309 of you watching at the moment, 167 of you on Twitter, or X if you prefer, and 142 of you on YouTube. We will be back at the same time on Monday. Thank you to everybody who's joined every stream across the course of this week. This is the regular time for it now, 10:30 GMT. And so there will be an announcement coming up over the course of this weekend on Patreon, an announcement video as to the how the Patreon content's going to be structured in the future. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you to everybody who supports the program on Patreon or via the Buy Me a Coffee site. Your support makes this happen, and thank you to everybody who's supported so far. Thank you to all of you who've stuck with this project since the early days, back when this was a co-hosted podcast back in 2021. I couldn't have anticipated the twists and the turns of this, but it's certainly, I think it's brought us to a good place with the scope to build something really good here. So thanks to everybody who's supported so far. Thanks to everybody who's watched the show. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. And I wish you all a good weekend, and I'll be back with you again on Monday.